Hi, my name is Walt Ray with the Trust for Public Land, and I'm very excited to bring to you at the Georgia Trail Summit today a very exciting discussion about a major regional trail proposed for Georgia. We call it the Chattahoochee Riverlands, and we have four speakers lined up to talk to you about this today. And we'll start with Byron Rushing introducing himself.
Hi, hello everyone. My name is Byron Rushing. I am the Walking and Bicycling Program Manager with the Atlanta Regional Commission. We've been excited to be working on the Riverlands projects for the past several years. It's a core piece of our regional trail vision, and thank you for having us today.
Great, and my name is Walt Ray. I'm the Chattahoochee Program Director for the Trust for Public Land. My job is to activate and preserve the Chattahoochee River and its valley from Helen, Georgia to Columbus, Georgia. And the Chattahoochee Riverlands is a core piece of this mission as it occupies what I call the metropolitan middle section of this 285-mile long stretch.
Hello, my name is Chris Barnes. I'm the project manager of the Chattahoochee Riverlands from Scape Landscape Architecture, and happy to be here today to present the project.
Hi, everyone. I'm Erin Thorson. I am a transportation planner with Gresham Smith, based here in our Atlanta office. We're part of the design team working with Scape on the Chattahoochee Riverlands.
Great. Next slide. So you all know the Chattahoochee River does begin as a spring up near Helen, Georgia in the Chattahoochee National Forest. And it does not stay this small. It actually grows quite a bit in depth and breadth as it continues downstream. It eventually becomes Lake Lanier, and Beaufort Dam, of course, holds back Lake Lanier, where our study area begins. And then the river flows out of Lake Lanier through 7 metro Atlanta counties and 19 metro Atlanta cities before eventually reaching the Chattahoochee Bend State Park, about 100 miles south, which is where our study area ends. Of course, the river continues flowing through to the Gulf of Mexico. Next slide. As important as this resource is, it is too many who live and work in the region here are disconnected from the river. Many are unaware of its existence or of the opportunities that they have to connect with this incredible natural resource. And we all think that it's time for that to change. The Chattahoochee Riverlands Greenway Study was envisioned by the Atlanta Regional Commission, the Cobb County, City of Atlanta, and the Trust for Public Land as an opportunity to reposition the Chattahoochee River from the region's back door to making it more of its front door. And the study began as a way to think about how do we redefine our relationship with the Chattahoochee and all that it has to offer. Next slide. The study overview is, we were looking at a 100-mile long corridor from Beaufort Dam to Chattahoochee Bend State Park. Next slide. And the project management team consisted of the Atlanta Regional Commission, the Trust for Public Land, Cobb County, and City of Atlanta. Next slide, and Byron's going to walk us through the project schedule.
Yeah, thank you, Walt. So as Walt mentioned, the Chattahoochee Riverlands initial idea came together in 2017 and 2018 as the Atlanta Regional Commission was completing a regional trail vision, and obviously the Chattahoochee River forms an important spine through the region. At the same time that the City of Atlanta was completing their city design vision, Cobb County was working on a county trails plan, and the Trust for Public Land was continuing their several decades of land stewardship and conservation. So all these pieces came together. The Chattahoochee River is so important to the metro region that it is hard to have a conversation in metro Atlanta that doesn't incorporate the Chattahoochee River somehow. So we all came together excited to be exploring this particular opportunity. And over the course of the year, the team kind of formed. We went out to pursue some federal grants. We were excited to win those. And then in 2018, really kick off the official Chattahoochee River Greenway study, which quickly became the Chattahoochee Riverlands. So very briefly, as a study overview, the way that we approach this traditionally as a planning project had a task for project management. We had a lot of stakeholders as well as a lot of team members. So there was a lot of communication between the project management staff about the best way to kind of get all these people moving in the same direction. And then I think very critically started with a literature review. We are really just the next generation thinking about conservation along the Chattahoochee River. People for eons have lived alongside the river, and planners for several decades 40 or 50 years have been thinking about how we protect this important natural resource. So starting with that, kind of going back to school and learning about the river and reading that literature was really, really super important, as well as a conditions analysis to understand life along the river and how things have changed. We pivoted from that into a corridor of vision and concept, which Chris is going to talk a little bit later in the presentation, for how we kind of project out, kind of cast out this big high-level vision for the river. And then really dove in after that, once we had an idea of where we wanted to go, into that Greenway Plain development and actually starting to trace that line. As we've joked, the Blue Way component of the river is easy to find because it's just in the river itself. But the Greenway to go along the edge of the river, cross back over, has taken a lot of time and effort to really understand the details of that. And we'll show you some maps for how that goes. And then the other critical piece was 100-mile or 120-mile Greenway is hard to envision. It's hard to get your mind around that. So we wanted to dive in some specific points and say, what will the trail look like at specific locations? Cobb County brought a piece of property that the county owns, which we called our pilot project. And Aaron will talk a little bit about that and the details that our team went into, really dive down to the inch level to understand that piece. And then we took a time to do some demonstration sites and kind of show through photo renderings how the trail will look in context. And we'll show you those as well too. And then finally, all of this was stitched together. It was wrapped up. It was encapsulated in public engagement, stakeholder engagement, talking to people along the river. We had some traditional ways of doing that with meetings that we met throughout the process. We tried to meet with stakeholders every month, either for progress updates or bigger kind of touch points. And then we did some more interesting stuff, river rambles, and taking people out to the river and experiencing the river alongside other people. And we'll show you some photos of that. But overall, these 7 tasks took us about 18 months. And we're kind of right at the 2-year point from when we started that, and we wrapped up the project in May. Next slide. I won't go into too much detail on all the design team. We have Scape. Chris is with us, and he's going to be giving the rest of the presentation. But Scape is a national landscape architecture company based in New York and New Orleans, and we were excited to have them in the metro region, bringing a national and international experience to how people interact with water bodies. And then supporting them was Gresham Smith. We have Aaron with us today, as well as Biohabitats, who is an ecological research firm, New South Associates, who's a historical research firm, and 2 professors from Georgia State and Spelman, Dr. Nataki Osborne-Jelks and Dr. Richard Milligan, who brought us a real deep look at equity, engagement, and the community vision, how these kinds of projects interface with the community. So overall, this is a tremendously smart team, and we're really, really excited to be working with such a great group of folks. Next slide. And then approach this. If you look at these bubbles, anything in the teal on the top part of this schedule was a moment of public engagement. So we were doing things continuously. We were meeting in big groups and small groups, both on the river and in closer to the communities where people live. And it was an intensive, it was a tiring schedule, but it was one that was really great for understanding the depth and perspective of people who live along the river, visit the river, use the river, or sometimes just pass by the river without even knowing it. And then on the bottom of it, if you see anything in a brown circle, or if you go to our final report and you see those brown boxes, those are what we call river stories. So they're places of historic or personal interest that we discovered doing this research to say, the fish weir, the traditional Native American sites along the river, or the moments of historic interest, or people who have really made history along the river. We try to capture as many of those stories as possible. And then finally, any of these green bubbles is a technical element. It's really the stuff for the planners and us to get into the maps and the details and really show some things. So this is a great slide. We'll revisit this at the very end of the presentation. This is a snapshot for how we approached a very busy 18 months. And with that, next slide, and I believe we're going to hand it to Chris now, right, Walt?
Yeah, Chris is going to talk to us about the process of studying the Riverlands and public engagement.
Great, thank you, Walt. I just wanted to I think, Byron, you said a lot of this, but I think this is really powerful for us as well, because it really touches on that every step of the way. For every month you can see here represented, that top of that line, there was a public engagement event scheduled, and different groups that we met with, different wide range of diverse peoples along the river. And it's important to note that that's really the the corridor itself, right? We talk about the place, the geography, and the river, but really it's the people. And it was important to note that as we went through this study, that those people really informed the deliverables, and they were crafted and shaped through their voice and their vision. You can see the 100-mile corridor represented here. So we really covered a large geographic area as well, which is one of the big challenges, I think, from a planning and design firm is how do we really kind of keep a robust planning approach over 100 miles. So we just had to physically move and meet a lot. And that's what this map represents. And I'll go in through the stakeholders in a second, but the engagement and the numbers, we kind of did a tally at the end. The Chattahoochee Working Group, which I'll introduce, we met with 120 individuals, 350 community members over 3 community events, 200 local stakeholders through various site visits and other events. And I'll plug the website here. We have the ChattahoocheeRiverlands.com, where this was made maybe 6 months ago, but we're getting traction through the website and using that as a tool to really market the project to the people in the region and build awareness as the project moves into the future. But we also had these other engagement events, physically bringing people to the river. We dubbed them river rambles, those public forums I mentioned, as well as sub-area committee meetings and local stakeholder meetings. I wanted to walk through a little bit of the stakeholder groups that we had for the project. So the first being the kind of steering committee was the Chattahoochee Working Group, which was established by the Trust for Public Land. And this group actually met before the RFP was even crafted for the event, and really thinking of what this Riverlands would be, developing the logo and some of those other things. So we were excited to work with this group that convenes monthly and still convenes monthly even after the study has been complete. But this is some 70 plus individuals representing entities from the federal level, the state level, the city, nonprofits. So a very diverse group that kind of represents that 100-mile region. The next is sub-area committees, which were convened just for the purposes of this study. So when we talk about 100 miles, how do you really kind of get down to a level where you can have meaningful expert engagement, I guess, at the stakeholder level. So we convened 3 sub-area committee groups dealing with local scientists, local politicians, city constituents, and neighborhood folks, and met with them throughout the course of the study as well. At the site scale, Byron introduced the pilot site. So we were actually meeting with neighborhood representatives and local community at that level as well. So moving from, again, the regional scale of 100 miles to the sub-area scale, which was some 20 miles each of the river, to down to the actual site scale, and engaging with folks along the way in different ways. We also went on numerous site visits, so thank you to anyone in the audience who showed us around over the last year and a half, but we were able to meet with people on site and local constituents as well in a more informal setting and capacity. And then public forums. This is a photo that we held our first public forum that helped us envision the goals of the project. But here we would have large models and other techniques to engage with the community, as well as help them interact and visualize the corridor and basically shape what those goals would become. So we had 3 of these kind of science fair style events. And then river rambles, we were really proud of these. We conceived of these initially at the onset of the proposal when we were writing the response, but the idea of just bringing people to the river and working with groups of people that might not necessarily engage or with the river, and kind of working with them in events that are fun, and finding ways to take those fun participatory events and wrap that back into the study. We think that was a pretty interesting layer to add to this engagement. And then finally the website. So the Riverlands, ChattahoocheeRiverlands.com. It's live and running now. I encourage everyone to go look, but it's an interesting forum. It's a map-based website, and what we were able to do is use this as a tool throughout the design process. So it tracked our movements. If we went to a site or met with a constituency group, we could add a pin to the map, and people could kind of track our progress and find out more about what we were up to. But it also kind of built upon these themes of history, ecology, access, and demographics along the way. So I encourage everyone to go look. And it also includes all of our reports and deliverables in a downloadable format, so you can really get in the details of what we'll introduce you to today. And as we think about 100 miles again from the perspective of the planner and the designer, how do you start a 100-mile regional planning study? We started the best way we knew as a large majority of our team is landscape architects. We got in a van and we drove around with our team, our stakeholders, our consultants, our client. Over the span of a week, we drove 100 miles. We hiked through the woods. We got a boat tour from our friends at Riverkeeper, and we were actually able to get on the river. We toured Proctor Creek Greenway with some neighborhood residents, but we also stopped along the way and had 3 neighborhood meetings and met with local constituents there. This is a great photo of a model that kind of evolved throughout the process, but the first model was a series of colored flags that really allowed people to envision their greenway and their corridor through the lens of these thematic colors. So they represented things like ecology, legacy, history, and those kind of things that ultimately evolved into the goals. So even from the onset, we were developing this narrative or this story that ultimately shaped the physical thing, which was the alignment of the greenway. And then I think Byron talked about this task 2, which was the research. So our task 2 memo, which, you think about an existing conditions report, you think it's pretty straightforward, but when you scale that up to 100 miles, it becomes quite cumbersome and long. This document actually, I think is upwards of 400 pages, and I encourage everyone to download it, but it actually captures a lot of the river, and us as a team coming here for the first time, a lot of us for the first time, and seeing the Chattahoochee River, how do you really dig in? And we really immersed ourselves in the place and tried to really understand not only the people, as I mentioned previously, but also the physical place, and how do we celebrate that? I'll quickly go through some summary slides, but again, we kind of frame that analysis in these thematic categories of history and cultural resources. So looking all the way back to the First Nations peoples and how they lived and engaged with the river, that the river was literally a place of bounty or life. They would fish here, use it for agricultural irrigation. But the river also over time became a political boundary. It became a source of energy with paper mills. It became a place of crossing with the ferry crossing, and then ultimately in the suburban sprawl of recent memory, where now we cross the river, but we don't necessarily see the river. So it's less of a barrier, but an afterthought. So all of that encapsulated in this map is really just this kind of rich history of the river. And if we look at it over this timeline, you can begin to see those different eras dating back to 8,000 BCE all the way to current day. We also looked at ecological resources. So we know that the river is a rich ecological resource. At certain areas of the river, this is threatened. At others, it is pristine and more so intact. But it's interesting what we did note in terms of fishery is that to the north, there's a rainbow and brown trout range that's introduced with the construction of Beaufort Dam and the cool water that comes from the dam. So that's a really unique thing that you'll find in the southeastern United States and a destination for fishermen. There's also the shoal bass range in the south. And you can kind of, if you squint at this map, you can see that in the north, the white is kind of developed land, and in the south, you can see that there is a lot of tract of forest that still remains. So getting ahead of that with this study and thinking of ways to protect that. We also looked at a river for all, or looked at demographics and thinking about vulnerable communities and the notion of development and how do we respond in different ways for these sensitive areas. So we used defined environmental justice target areas or vulnerable areas and flagged those for further thought as we went through the study, as you can see here, and also thinking about just the growth of this region in the next 10 years with the growth of Atlanta and some of its suburbs. And then finally, we looked at land use. So I think this is really telling map here, where the next slides, I'll get into those sub areas that I mentioned, but you can kind of see with the land use here, how there's a pattern that emerges where you can kind of see 3 distinct zones. In the north, you can see this yellow color offset from the river within our study area, and that's single family homes and mostly residential land. And then in the center, you see this purple or pink color, and that's industrial land use in the west side of Atlanta. And then south of that, you really see this teal color, which represents that forest or agricultural land. So even at this land use scale or this mapping, you can really see the patterns emerge for 3 distinct kind of regions of the river. And then as we think about, those three distinct zones, we're also thinking about what are we trying to do here? Like what are the Riverlands? And, some people might approach this, oh, it's a trail, right? But a trail needs destinations, it needs nodes, but knowing the river, it's also a blueway, right? That we're dealing with one of the national designated waterways in the northern stretch of the river, but how do we continue that down and think about aligning those terrestrial destinations and trails with the blueway nodes as you go downriver? And then how do we connect to uphill communities, right? We think about the Agape Youth Center that we introduced. They live just a mile from the river, but often don't see it. So how can we connect these communities that are just adjacent to this great natural resource? So when you put all these things together, you get the Riverlands. So it's important to keep that in mind, that it's not just a single trail or one element, but it's the composite of these things that forms this open space corridor through the region. And thinking about how do we begin to think about the identity and maybe zoom in on scale just a little bit. So thinking about the regional scale, which we just went through, but then zooming in and trying to digest this thing into three parts so that we as planners and designers can begin to address it, right? So this goes back, I think, the land use mapping that I mentioned, even though all of those summary or conclusion maps really exemplify three distinct zones. I think that the land use was the most telling, but in the north, having sub-area 1, which is the suburban parklands, which is really the Chattahoochee River National Recreational Area and all of its park units, and that single-family suburban land use trend. In the center, the west side of Atlanta, being this industrial land use and some of the most vulnerable communities that you'll see in the corridor. And then moving to the south, looking at population trends and the growth population push to the south, and thinking about the land use here, where it's historic agricultural tracts, so large tracts of land owned by single families or single landowners, with less dense hamlet communities. So we tried to kind of visualize that, because that's what we do. We're trying to take 20 miles and put it into a 2x2 tile, and you can kind of get a sense of the feeling or the identity of these zones. So sub-area 1, the suburban parklands, obviously, again, those park units, and kind of a moment where when you're in these spaces, you're really immersed in this riverine corridor. Moving to sub-area 2, where you begin to see some of those impacts of urban Atlanta and the industrial area, and then to the south, again, that much smaller footprint of settlement and development. And so this is just some photos, but even in the suburban parklands, you can see the river is pristine. At most times, you can really see impacts here, though, at the urban core with the numerous highway crossings and eroded banks. And then that feeling from the agrarian countryside. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Juan.
Great, thanks, Chris. I was just going to talk briefly about the goals and strategies that evolved out of all of the studying and all of the public engagement. I just want to make sure that you all understand that the design team and the project management team didn't start out with a project with our stated goals. We worked iteratively with the public, the Chattahoochee Working Group, with the sub-area committees to develop these goals and strategies over several months. Chris, if you go to the next slide, we can talk about the first one. You ended up with four kind of big goals, and these were obviously very, very well vetted with stakeholder groups and others, and edited many times. But the first goal that we all understood sort of intuitively when we entered the process was we all wanted to develop some sort of safe, connected corridor. And we see this as the land trail, the greenway trail, the water trail or the blueway trail, and tributary trails, but all having one singular feel and one singular user experience, regardless of what jurisdiction we're in, or if we're in the north sub-area or south sub-area. We want them all to feel very, very cohesive and offer one singular user experience through all the different jurisdictions. The next slide, please, Chris. We also wanted to talk about a common ground for all. We all recognize that the Metro Atlanta region has a very diverse and ever diversifying demographic profile, and we have different ages and different physical abilities and different ethnic backgrounds and different cultures. And we wanted to make sure that when we were designing the Riverlands and thinking about what this Riverlands is, that every population felt welcome here every population could see themselves doing something, whether you're someone who has who needs, who has physical disabilities and needs an easy, fully accessible trail to use, or whether you're someone who's maybe more senior and so has limited abilities for physical endurance, or wherever you're from and whatever you're interested in doing, we want to make sure that everyone could find a home here, picture themselves and feel welcome. Next slide. We talk about the third goal, which is an ecological refuge for the region. I think early, all the stakeholders with the Chattahoochee Working Group and many others, but really it became very obvious that the Chattahoochee River is best or maybe most known for ecological concerns and ecological challenges. And we wanted to make sure that whatever we were doing with the Chattahoochee River and its banks not only didn't degrade the ecological value of the river, but maybe even improve the ecological value of the river. So can the Chattahoochee Riverlands and whatever we propose here improve the ecological health of the river and its basin? And that was the third goal that we really held ourselves to very highly. And then the fourth goal, if Chris will advance the slide, is a living legacy for future generations. We know that whatever we did propose for this 100-mile stretch was crossing 100 miles of very different territories, but also 8,000 years of different cultures inhabiting the banks and using them. We wanted to make sure that we could remember and reveal the history of all those years and generations and different iterations of cultures and peoples living along the river. But also whatever we developed, we want to make sure would compel the next generation to want to continue implementing it, continue using it, continue loving it, and stewarding the river and its banks for all the future generations to come. And if we go to the next slide, Chris is going to walk us through very briefly the process that we use to align the Riverlands Trail, the Greenway Trail.
Great, thank you, Walt. So with this next section, we'll try to be a little brief, but try to give you a glimpse under the hood of how we began to actually draw an alignment. So taking the goals and the existing conditions report that I previously talked about, we began to actually put pen to paper and set up basically criteria and analysis points that would help guide the trail. So we hosted an alignment workshop. That was the first step with the PMT and the broader project team. And then we came up with 3 distinct alignments that we brought to the stakeholder groups. And then we came back and then we had a public forum, and then out the other side came the preferred alignment. So it was important that we take the first step to kind of ground truth some of these lines, but then we really workshopped them at numerous points with different public and stakeholders. And to basically set the alignment, we set up a number of kind of screening or analyses tools. So some of the basic things like topography, a slope analysis. We worked with biohabitats to create an ecological screening technique that looked at kind of contiguous forest patches and ways to basically keep those intact, because the last thing we wanted to do was split up those forests. Things like the floodplain and other MERPA considerations were also kind of weaved into that suitability analysis as well. And then we just looked at general kind of path of least resistance, which at the bottom right is kind of a snapshot of all of those together, but that blue line being a path of least resistance. But it's important to note that these are really just kind of tools, and that we on the ground, had to make those decisions and find the best way or the best outcomes. And often we found ourselves internally conflicted, as well as conflicted with the public. So we thought the best way to go about this was to kind of come up with alternatives. So from the onset, thinking about different approaches where the path of least resistance might be the easiest path to build day one, right? Where we might utilize things like easements and tie into publicly owned land. The trail might actually be along existing roadways a lot more often than we'd like. It might be away from the river a lot more often than we'd like. And then we looked at the path of least ecological impact. So basically bypassing any kind of valued forest patches, any wetlands, minimizing crossings, and looking for the most impacted land to kind of partner with restoration opportunities. And then the final one, which I think is the most optimistic, was kind of the network of destinations, where we kind of departed a little bit from that screening and those analysis processes, and just really tried to connect as many valuable nodes and destinations as we could. But with these three approaches, we essentially came up with three unique alignments that we were able to test with the public and the stakeholders. And this is from our alignment workshop. So you can see, I don't know if you can see on the maps, but the red, the green, and the yellow all represent one of those approaches. But we physically, over the course of 3 days, drew every linear foot of the entire greenway with those three alignments in mind. I think this room was something like 80 to 100 feet long, and we chained all the tiles together and drew on these clear vellum overlays. So it was kind of a fun workshop that you probably don't often get to see and participate in. And with that, I'll hand that over to Byron to go over the final preferred alignment.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So we'll walk a little bit high level through some of the preferred alignment pieces. So let's go ahead and jump to the next slide. We have lots of these tiles. I can't remember the exact number, but it's about a dozen or so going in 5-mile stretches all down the river. So we started here at Lake Lanier and Beaufort Dam. So if you're in a plane over Lake Lanier looking south down the river, or looking with the flow of the river into Gwinnett and Forsyth counties, and then down towards the city of Atlanta, just off the left side of the slide here. Really kind of looking, as Chris mentioned, into these exact alignments. So the yellow or goldish yellow line is our preferred alignment. The teal lines are our practical alternatives, so places where we need to deviate from that preferred alignment for short-term success or ease of navigating the corridor. They're there for us, and they're not any on this map, but those other alternatives, those really great to have spots that if conditions change over time, they'll be available to us. So let's move to the next slide. And it's important here to say that we were looking at about 100 miles of river, and that came to about 125 miles of the Riverlands in that kind of best preferred alignment, as well as 44 miles of, 44 tributary trails. And these are really important because for us at ARC and the regional connection, these are the pieces that go in and out of the corridor. They spread to the nearby communities. They form those trail towns in the kind of bigger picture of the Riverlands, not just that alignment. We have 140 miles of practical alternatives. So as Chris mentioned, if there are places that it's easier to use, we might deviate, go further from the river out a little bit further, which might not be the scenic experience we're looking for, but it might often be a better connection to transit or nearby community. And then we have 154 miles of impractical or other alternatives, things that we would like to have. They're going to kind of keep that corridor a little bit closer as that evolves over time. So if you hear me talk about this in the future, the Chattahoochee Riverlands is 100 to 150 miles, depending on how it ultimately shapes out. There are a million residents within a 15-minute bike ride of the trail, and that represents a fifth to a sixth of the region's population, not to mention all the visitors who come from elsewhere. And there are 19 cities connected, many of the cities who have an existing relationship with the river, and many who are kind of rediscovering the river right now in this part of the century. Next slide. 26 parks connected. This has really been trust for public lands, bailiwick, and specialty over the past several generations. And many of those cities that we have talked to are finding new ways to uncover new park property and make these really destinations and features of their communities. Next slide. 25 trailheads, and this has been a really important number for us because there's several access points to the river currently, but they're not consistently distributed across the corridor. So we really aimed for having consistent access points up and down the river. And you can see that if you go to some of the slide tiles and see how we really kind of measure the progress of our project by the number of trailheads and the number of access points. Next slide. 42 water access points, so one every 2 miles, 25 existing and 17 proposed. And the bulk of those 17 are really in the southern portion of the river that don't have a lot of access currently. Next slide. And then finally, this is, we skipped a bunch of tiles and we landed down here at the very southern end, the bottom end of our study area with the Chattahoochee Bend State Park, which is a Georgia state park, and a wonderful destination right on the edge of the metro region. That's a great day trip and about 100 float miles or 125 bike riding miles down from Beaufort Dam.
Right, so Chris is going to very briefly, and just Chris know that we're about 10 minutes left. Chris is going to walk us through the demonstration sites, and then we'll hear from Aaron Thorson about the pilot project site.
So the next task that we had to do after we aligned the Riverlands Trail was really demonstrate those 4 guiding goals that Walt had mentioned, but kind of demonstrate them on a site scale. So how might the Greenway actually come through at a site level, and what amenities might need to be there, and how can we demonstrate that? So we worked with the Chattahoochee Working Group to basically select three sites over the 100 miles, and through an interactive worksheet we developed, we kind of solicited a lot of different feedback, different proposals. We ended up with some, 12 sites, but we knew we only could do 3, so we had to ultimately we picked 1 from each sub area. And where we landed was 3 demonstration sites that had the Riverlands portrayed. So we had the Sugar Hill Trailhead in the north near Beaufort Dam, the Proctor Creek Trail Extension, Atlanta's west side, and then the Chattahoochee Hills Riverlands Park, which was a large expanse of land in the southern area of the study area. So looking at the Sugar Hill Trailhead was really looking at connecting 2 existing Chattahoochee River National Recreational Area park units, and looking at providing water access point at what is a historic fish weir, which was used to essentially capture fish in pre-settlement times, and providing a low impact trail and road system that gets you to an interpretive pavilion. And what's another great thing about this site is that it's right adjacent to a restoration project that's ongoing now. And we were able to actually work with the city as part of the Chattahoochee Working Group. So you can get a glimpse of what that might look like on the ground here. And really just, this one really grapples with how do you design directly adjacent to the river. But what does that begin to look like with things like sensory railings for people that are visually impaired, kind of the material delineation of the trail, thinking about ways to begin to engage with the natural rock and shoal geologic formations, as well as thinking about wayfinding. So this was a really good way to begin to test some of these ideas at the human scale. The next site we looked at is the Proctor Creek Trail Extension. So this is looking at the Proctor Creek in the Greenway that one day will tie to the Chattahoochee is our hope, and the Chattahoochee Riverlands will tie to it. But looking at this as a critical intersection at Atlanta's west side that would ultimately connect Atlanta to the Chattahoochee proper, and just thinking about how that intersection might occur. And one thing we looked at is this interpretive site that has a kind of industrial legacy, but looking at engaging with the Proctor Creek on your way to the Chattahoochee River through the use of bank stabilization, different other elements that get you down to the water that could be used for an outdoor classroom and other kind of recreational facilities for the neighborhood. And then the last site we looked at was the Chattahoochee Hills Riverlands Park, which is in the city of Chattahoochee Hills. So this is where we really had a lot of land in the southern reach, hundreds of acres, and looked at a new community center, primitive camping, and other things that might tailor to the Blue Way, where you could imagine paddling, stopping, and camping for the day, as well as various restoration points. And this is just the boat launch envisioned here for the Chattahoochee Riverlands.
Right, and in a second, we're going to hear from Aaron Thorson with Gresham Smith, who really was really in the weeds with a pilot project site. And I just wanted to remind you all, the pilot project site was a very specific site in Cobb County, where we had the luxury of having an actual field run survey. And we had about a 2-mile section of river to play with. As we examined, the ideas that we were talking about, the 4 big goals, and the ideas that we were talking about for 100 miles, how do those apply to an actual site, and how do those test with the regulatory framework? And Aaron's going to talk to us about what we learned and proposed with that.
Great, thank you, Walt. Yeah, so the pilot site is on Cobb County owned land. It is situated between Mableton Parkway and Veterans Memorial Highway. If you can go to the next slide, Chris. And it was identified at the outset of the project because it's county-owned land and really sat at the heart of the study area here. You can see Mableton Parkway on the left side of the screen and Veterans Memorial Highway on the right-hand side of the screen there to the north. And we set out to take a deeper dive into this segment and really explore, just as Walt said, what happens when the trail actually meets the river and meets an existing site and all of the constraints that come with that. There is, a lot of topography and changes in elevation present within this site. You have Discovery Boulevard to the west, where there's some light industrial development there. And you have the stormwater runoff that comes from the parking lots and the roadway that drains across the site. And so what does it mean to thread a trail through this existing site? How do you treat that stormwater? And how do you work within the existing regulations? The Metropolitan River Protection Act, for example, applies within this area. And what does that mean in terms of land disturbance and impervious surface present within the site itself? And so what we did really was through numerous site visits and a bunch of field work, we really explored every inch of this site and tried to understand what it would look like to put a trail through this area. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we've proposed about 2.5 miles of paved and unpaved trails. This site crosses Nickajack Creek. You can see right at the center of your screen there. So we'll need a bridge to get across the creek there. And it also crosses several smaller streams and creeks present throughout the site. The pilot project provides a direct connection to a Cobb County Parks project that is currently in development, kind of nestled there to the north of Nickajack Creek between our pilot project and Discovery Boulevard. And so we wanted to provide that connection so that the users of this site have access to those footpaths as well as to the small trailhead and parking area that will be provided by the County Parks Department. And not only was this site really grounded in this hyper-local context, but we were also trying to demonstrate the design strategies and project goals, as Walt mentioned, and showcase the potential of the entire Riverlands corridor. Next slide. In exploring the site in more detail, we were tracing existing utility easements, trying to work parallel to the river, and heard from our steering committee that it was incredibly important not only to showcase the river itself, but also to highlight the wetlands and wooded areas that are present within the site. So we wanted to provide space for pedestrians and cyclists using different surface materials here. As you can see, they've been shown in some of the other renderings and illustrations to kind of differentiate those different user spaces and ensure that everyone feels safe and comfortable using this. In some cases, we had to physically pull the trail apart. So you can see it separated here by a swath in the middle. In part, that was to minimize clearing and follow the existing easements and former road beds that are present within the site, but also to avoid the manholes that are present on the site and kind of take advantage of the natural surface that's out there. Next slide. It was really important, as I had mentioned, to showcase not only the river itself and provide those overlooks to the water and the linear trail for biking and walking, but also to give people an opportunity to interact with the other natural features that are present on this site. So here you can see what we're calling an education nook. And all throughout the site and along the Riverlands, really, we've identified these opportunities for kind of gathering spaces, informal classrooms, outdoor seating, places to just stop and rest, pull off to the side of the trail, but also to engage and explore with the wetlands, the wilderness and wildlife that exists on the site. And this area shown here is where the pedestrian ramble, so kind of a pedestrian-only trail upstream of Nickajack Creek, meets with a cross trail that takes you down closer to the river as well. And we wanted to showcase how you can really provide an opportunity to directly engage with the river itself. And we're calling this kind of a wetland window in a way. It provides an opportunity to see what's happening below the surface of the boardwalk itself. With that, I'll turn it back.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And the pilot project site is really very exciting. I think as the study is wrapping up, Byron, would you like to share some thoughts about what's next?
Yeah, thank you, Walt. And I'll just say very briefly from ARC's perspective, there's a tremendous amount of work to do. We are on the slide here, or a little bit after here, at the end of the summer of 2020, having done a tremendous amount of study work, having a lot of facts, data, and images. But that's really day one for the next thing. So ARC will continue to find ways to shepherd this project, find funding opportunities, work with all of our communities as a governmental partner for how to shepherd this vision forward, and with our private and non-governmental stakeholders like TPL to continue to keep this vision alive. We're very excited about this project. It's gotten a lot of press. It's gotten a lot of feedback, both supportive as well as critical, both of which are very important. And we will continue to really kind of try to be champions and shepherds for this. And that's really ARC's perspective. We host a big table of regional partners, and we will continue to do what we can to bring people to that conversation. But I'll let Walt continue with the next generation of implementation for where we're heading.
Great. Yeah. So as you can see from the timeline, I actually love this slide because it also terrifies me. We've spent the past 2 years investigating all the work of the past and building a framework for implementation of a project over 100 miles long that we know will take a generation or two to implement, or longer. The Trust for Public Land is very committed to, as Byron said, to championing the implementation of this project. Sometimes we'll lead projects, sometimes we'll support others. We have a lot of different roles we can play, but always with a goal of let's look at 100 miles and let's get this thing built for the region and for the people who live and work and play here. And we will continue to convene the Chattahoochee Working Group to support the administrative issues that we need with supporting the website and the sort of region-wide communications about the Chattahoochee and the Riverlands and the potential that is locked within this big vision, and continue to provide the kind of platforms where those discussions can continue to evolve and grow. And then also, our big goal is to really start seeing, projects come to the surface through funding, through advocacy, through other things, where we can start to actually demonstrate the potential of the Riverlands, where we can build or partner with jurisdictions to build what we call pilot project sites or demonstration sites that really build positive momentum for the implementation of this multi-generational project. And we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.